or I just raised way too many questions by the time it's all over with. Obviously, what Jeff said, that tonight I'm going to be talking about this whole situation with Brexit, and going to talk a lot about that, and more importantly, put it in a context of what's going on here in Texas. But I did want to take a moment and essentially make a statement on what transpired over the last 48 hours with the shooting in Florida. Obviously, there is no doubt that it is a tragedy. Anytime you have people with a radical ideology inflict violence upon other human beings, it's a tragedy. It is a tragedy just as much as the tragedy of the persecution of the Christians throughout the Middle East, where they are systematically wiped out, brutally murdered and tortured, men, women, children. So I want to say that it is important for us as Texans to acknowledge that over the coming days, we are going to be inundated with cries for people to do something. And understand that it is the sole responsibility of the person who pulled the trigger for that heinous act. He is not alone in bearing responsibility for the overall problem. You see, we're going to get calls that we have to do something, and that something is always going to involve the federal government. They will continue to cry out and say, give us a solution, whether it's a solution to radical Islam or a solution to what they perceive as gun violence. They will cry out to the federal government for a solution. And this is the federal government, the same one whose insane bureaucracy made this possible, and their weakness and willingness to kowtow to political correctness made it a probability. So it is important for us as we move on and examine the issue that I'm going to talk about tonight, that we understand in this context that the federal government does bear responsibility, but we are not alone in paying the price for bureaucratic ineptitude. So that being said, let's talk about Brexit. Now, the last time that I was here, and I know this is a very difficult transition, but I had to say that because I think it's fundamentally important for you to understand where folks like us come from on this particular issue. Because Florida, what happened and what transpired in Orlando is symptomatic of not just a problem here in Texas and the rest of the United States, but it is something that is happening on a worldwide basis. This is something that we are being affected by, whether we decide to turn a blind eye or not. It is affecting every single solitary one of us. So the last time that I was here, you may remember that, I guess, how should I put it? On the issue of a Texas referendum to leave the Union, I intended to misbehave. I was engaged in what the establishment referred to as mischief, as folly. Remember that? We had the petition going, we had this thing going, and we were going to force this issue. And in that intervening time, what we saw was our inability to get the signatures by the legally prescribed method. We saw the State Republican Executive Committee, through an absolute hero, Tanya Robertson, introduce a resolution calling for a referendum on Texas independence, right? We almost had one in March, 2 bites of the apple, that they shot down even though it passed by a large majority out of their platform committee. And then you saw us take a run at the Republican State Convention. Mm-hmm. The Republican State Convention, which is the largest political convention, as they will tell you, in the world. And what we saw there was we saw passage out of subcommittee, we saw passage out of the temporary platform committee by a 2/3 vote, and then we saw shenanigans that knocked it out of the vote in the permanent platform committee. Yeah. And then what we saw was we saw people at the convention take to the microphone, standing in line for upwards of 4 hours, Mr. Sadeghi being one of them, to introduce it as an amendment to the platform, calling for a vote on Texas independence. And then what we got to watch was a full-on floor debate on the merits of the people of Texas voting on their right of self-government. And from that time, we got to see the vote stolen from the majority of the people who stood up in favor of it.
That's right, absolutely.
Anyone who was there will tell you that that's exactly what happened. People came to me and they said, "Aren't you disappointed?" I said, "Absolutely not." You see, because when this process started, as Jeff said 20 years ago, this was about it, right? I would speak in rooms, sometimes I was the only person there. I would show up and nobody was there. We started out having meetings with 2, 4, 10, 20 people. The supporters of Texas independence polled in the single digits. So to see the state's dominant political party, the delegates representing that entire party, stand up in a majority, regardless of whether it was stolen or not, stand up and say, "We believe the people of Texas should at least have the right to vote on their independence." That's huge. But you see, all of that has some context, which brings me to the idea of Brexit, and why we're here tonight, I believe. You see, as Jeff said, on June 23rd, a political earthquake is going to shake the world. It's already happening. The United Kingdom, already having to deal with a previous vote for Scotland to pull out of the UK, they decided to stay in, where they endured 2 years of debate and adult conversation on Scotland leaving the UK. Well, mostly adult conversation. You know, the Project Fear guys were definitely good at what they did, but they decided to stay in. But the underlying debate that has transpired over those years has been one of the UK's relationship with the rest of the European Union. Now, let me explain to you what that means in a nutshell. Because what I have found out is that for the most part, the details of the political system and the way the world works stop at the oceans. Now, I'm talking to a group of people that are way more informed than the average person, but the average person would literally think that Brexit was the meal that was sandwiched between breakfast and lunch. They don't understand what that means. They know that there's a European Union, but they don't know what that means. And if you tell them the UK, they want to know if it's the rap group from Port Arthur. They understand Britain. A lot of people don't understand that England and Britain are two different things. There are nuances in the political sphere when you get beyond the oceans that reverberate here. So in 1973, the UK, which was referred to as the sick man of Europe because of their really, really bad economy. Why was their economy bad? Because of centralized planning and control and overregulation. They stared down at the prosperity that was being brought about by what was happening with the German miracle in Western Europe and the foundations of the EU, and they said, "Hey, we want a piece of that, right? We want to be part of this free trade zone." So they joined what was called the European Common Market. Now, you'll hear a lot about that. As you start tuning into this whole Brexit debate, you'll hear this term common market. And so the people of the UK went to the polls in 1973 and said, "We will be part of the common market. We're going to join this trade union." You'll hear them refer to it as a customs union, but it's an economic union. It says, look, we're going to drop tariffs. We're going to trade together. We're going to be able to export our goods into the European countries, and they'll be able to export them back. And so the people of the UK entered into this economic union with a thought that that's what it was, and that's what it would always be. But in the intervening years, tell me if this sounds familiar, in the intervening years, it morphed into something that was unrecognizable to the people who voted in that referendum. It went from being a sole common economic market that was designed to drop tariffs and increase trade, and became more and more like a political union. You see, when the European Union started up, that was always the European dream. The European dream was that we would have a European Union, and so therefore France and Germany wouldn't kill each other at the slightest offense any longer. But what has happened is they have over the decades centralized control in Brussels, right? That is their Washington, D.C., for those of you playing the home version of the game. As they have centralized control and regulation has grown and has intruded in the lives of every single solitary person, and they have engaged in the folly of a single currency called the euro, and they brought in these poorer countries from the former Soviet bloc and the southern Mediterranean that have, I mean, their economies are so disparate from what was going on in Western Europe that they absorbed all of that political folly, all of that fallout left from the Soviet Union, and now they are bearing the brunt. So now you have countries like the UK that are subsidizing other poorer states of Europe. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
The UK is upset because the balance is about 10 billion pounds a year. But in Texas, we're upside down to the tune of anywhere from $100 to $150 billion a year. Familiar? Sound about right? So over the last 20 years, coincidentally, you've had politicians come out and speak out about the relationship between the UK and the rest of the European Union. Now, this is all with the context of all of these bad things that are taking place in the last 10 years, right? Everybody remember the Greece bailouts? The Greek economy taking a noser in Portugal, in Italy, in Spain. All of that has fueled what has been called Euroscepticism, that are forcing people to re-examine the role of their country within the EU. Are we getting a good deal out of this? Is the question that they're asking themselves. So, throughout all of these years, you've had politicians stand up in the UK, Conservative, Labour, not so much the Liberal Democrats, but that's another story. But then you had the foundation of a party called the UK Independence Party. And the UK Independence Party, those of you who do not know, has as a party leader a man named Nigel Farage. You guys ever heard of him?
Yep.
Look him up on YouTube. Trust me, you will enjoy it. Nigel Farage, F-A-R-A-G-E. A man who got elected to the European Parliament for the sole purpose of going there in every single solitary day talking trash about the European Union. It is the equivalent of us getting a senator or a congressman elected and sending them to Washington, D.C., and every time they took the mic on the floor saying, this union is extremely bad and we want out of it. It's a failed experiment. That's what Nigel Farage did. So with that constant drumbeat, they forced the Conservative government of the UK to agree to a referendum on their independence. And so on June 23rd, was this 11 days now? 10 days, 11 days from now? The people of the UK, after a very strong and vigorous debate on the benefits of staying in the Union or the benefits of leaving the European Union and becoming self-governing and independent again, they're going to file into their polling places and they are going to cast what is perhaps the most important vote as they see it for their country in their lifetimes. But I posit this, and I stand on the side with Nigel when he says this, is that that vote, the fact that they are even having that vote, will reverberate around the globe. Because you see, this vote for independence can prove that first world powers, civilized Western democracies, can have adult conversations about important things. And that the right of the people to determine how they govern themselves is inviolable. It is a right that is enjoyed around the world. This, to me, is the first example. Scotland was great, but the UK is something even different. Because their argumentation for leaving the European Union is so similar to the argumentation that we're using. Scotland in 2014 was inspirational for us. You know, people in a first world power going to the polls, having a 2-year debate on how they should govern themselves. Should they leave the United Kingdom? But there's something different about this. Because, as I said, the argumentation being used for the UK to actually leave the European Union is so similar to the things that we're saying. You could almost take the speeches and the arguments that are being given in that debate and substitute the word Texas for UK, and Washington for Brussels, and US for EU, and Obama for whoever one of their unelected bureaucrats is over there. Take your pick. I mean, you think it's bad here? We have one president. The European Union has 4.
Ooh.
5. Correction. Somebody watched the Brexit movie, right? 5. So what are the arguments? Well, I saw someone a moment ago mouth the word sovereignty. And at the core of that Brexit debate is the issue of sovereignty. At the core of the debate on the UK leaving the EU is that of sovereignty. It is the composition of the European Union, where the European Union has transformed from what was an economic union to one that, in the words of the Lisbon Treaty, it brings about ever closer union. You see, the thing to understand is that Brussels looks at Washington, D.C. with envious eyes. The way that the federal government has it is what they want. Let me give you an example. They're upset that there are about 70,000 pages of EU laws and regulations that affect every man, woman, and child in the United Kingdom. Here in Texas, let me tell you how that works for us. You see, in 2013, the National Archives decided that they would do a study. They wanted to know how many federal laws and regulations that affect the average person. How many are actually on the books? How many pages of laws and regulations? And without taking into account court precedent, right, court decisions from federal courts, or treaties, or executive orders, everyone's favorite here, I'm sure, or administrative laws, rules, and procedures, right, tell them how to do business, how they manage their departments. They came up with over 175,000 pages of federal rules, laws, and regulations. So I kind of chuckle when I hear them talk about overbearing bureaucrats and massive bureaucracy in the EU when we've lapped them almost 3 times over on that type of stuff. But you see, it doesn't end there. Not by any stretch of the imagination. You see, they're upset because the European Union has formed 90 different departments and commissions and agencies. 90. Ooh. Where here in Texas, we are affected by 440 different federal agencies and commissions. 440. You think that's interesting? Take a look at this. They're upset that there are 10,000 employees of the European Union that make more than the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Wow. We're here, if you take out the FBI, the CIA, pretty much any national security contractor, security officers, the White House, Congress, the Postal Service, you take those guys out of the equation. Okay, we're going to put them over here because we can't get figures for people like that. We're not privileged. It's not available to the common man. So you take them out of the equation and what do you get? There are 89,000 federal employees that make more than the governor of the state of Texas. Now, there are probably some arguments to be made why that's not necessarily a bad thing that his salary is capped. But the fact of the matter is, if you compare apples to apples, you see that they called a referendum with much less grievance than we should have. With much less grievance than people like us should have in our relationship with the federal government. And I go back to a statistic that I told you guys earlier. The UK is upset because they've got about a 10 billion pound upside down with how much money they put into Brussels and the EU, which then in turn, they take that money And then they put it into all of these institutions. They spend it like a sugar daddy to buy favor. So what do you get? When you have a debate like this, like they're having, who are the ones to come out on the side of staying in the European Union? The people that are benefiting from being fed a percentage of their own money. Want to talk about familiarity? The $100 to $150 billion imbalance that we have here in Texas, this is the thing that always gets me, especially when people complain about disaster declarations and getting that federal money back. The thing that just absolutely boggles me about that sort of argument is that we deal with it here on a regular basis. $150 billion goes into the federal coffers every single solitary year. Out of your pocket, in your pocket, in your pocket, in your pocket, that we never see. Okay, that's not the $300 billion that we're paying in. That's just the amount of that we don't get back. And so what do? Well, they give it to our public schools and say, if you don't allow transgender in your bathrooms, you don't get that money anymore. They say, if you don't do exactly what we tell you to do, you don't get any of it. But if you behave, if you're a good little boy or girl, and you sing out of the same hymn book as your federal overlords, you'll get your check. Is it any coincidence that we see more and more support for federal programs and federal overreach from the people that are receiving from the federal largesse? You want to talk about how that affects Texas? Think about that redistribution that goes to the other states, right? Think about that. Think about for a moment how that $150 billion a year is redistributed to these other states. And understand there are states out there that absolutely love the federal government. Because the federal government, well, technically it's not the federal government subsidizing it, it's you and me, right? But they support those things. And so what you have is you have the Brexiteers over there looking at 10 billion pounds a year and saying, enough is enough. So you could break it down to the issues of economics and bureaucracy, but the fundamental question, I believe, and what is at the heart of this debate over Great Britain leaving the European Union is that word that we heard earlier, and that is sovereignty. You see, unlike so many here, there are people that are still there, that live there in large numbers, that believe in the concept of a nation state. They understand that the European Union is not a super state of 500 million citizens of the European Union. They understand, I am British, I am French, I am Greek, I am German. They understand that they are part of a sovereign and independent nation state. But you see, the lesson for us here is Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution, where it starts off with the words, Texas is a free and independent state. Texas is a free and independent state. You see, we have it. We should have that mindset. And I got to tell you, based on what I saw at the convention, I believe that there are still a majority of Texans here who believe that as well. I believe that there, just like we see in the UK, I believe that there are a majority of Texans that don't believe living under 175,000 pages of federal rules, regulations, that overwhelming, overbearing, unwieldy federal bureaucracy. I believe that there are enough people here that will reject that. You see, I got to see it with my own eyes, that the people, a majority of which in the largest political party in the state of Texas, the dominant political party, stood up and said, I believe that even if I don't believe we should leave, I believe that we should at least be able to vote on the issue. I believe, because I see what's going on in places like Scotland and the UK, that it is possible that we can have an adult conversation about the relationship between Texas and the federal government. I see it. You know, in doing what I have done for 20 years, I have seen many people around the world raise their head and stand among the nations, like Sam Houston said that we would do at some time in the future. I have seen the rise of people standing up and saying, I understand who I am, and I understand that I have a right to govern myself according to the way that we believe we should be governed. It is about sovereignty, and that idea that you get down to could sum up the entire Brexit argument in one statement. The best people to govern Britain are the British. You hear them say it time and time again. We believe in Britain. And it's something that we say time and time again about Texas, is we believe that the best people to govern Texas are the Texans. Not Massachusetts Democrats, not federal bureaucrats who live out of our pocketbooks, not Californians who want to ban some kind of small fish and so we all have to pay the price. But the best people to govern Texas are Texans, because I believe in Texas. And this is the beautiful thing about it. And I will bring this to a close, and then we can go into Q&A. Jeff will be so happy about that. And frankly, it's because I have my coffee sitting on the table and it's calling my name. But I will say this. It is vitally important that you keep your eyes on the UK. Not because what we are doing is exactly like they're doing. In the end, their fight, their debates, their arguments are theirs and theirs alone. It's what we said when the Scottish referendum came around in 2014, because frankly, no two people on the planet could be so diametrically opposed politically than we are from the Scottish people. But that's their fight. It's their choice. It's their vote. And when they get to exercise, whether it's them or the people of the UK or the people of France or whatever's going to happen to the EU over the next 20 years, even if there is an EU, or even here, when the people of California, you guys may not know this, they actually had a California National Party candidate on the ballot during the primaries, during the assembly vote this last go around. We may be diametrically opposed on policy, but when any of us get to exercise our right of self-determination, it is a cause of celebration. So June 23rd, with the 6-hour time difference, I will be absolutely glued to social media and to the TV. Because I know that regardless of what they decide, leave or remain, that what happens on that day is historic, and it means a lot for us. That is, if the indication is there that seeing the inspiration that people are getting from it. So I admonish you to do this. If you believe that Texans, whether you believe in leave or remain here in Texas, if you just want to be able to do what the people of the UK have done, and that is have an adult debate and a vote on the issue, then there is one solution for you and one solution alone at this moment, and that is the Texas legislature. The Texas legislature, these legislators are already working on legislation for the next session. The ones that have a lock on their seat are already working on it. I know here how many of you were in House 21? 21. I know right now that they're working on legislation. So your state representative and your state senator need to hear from you. I know it sounds strange to say that you need to go out there and you need to tell these guys what they should already know. Because trust me, the word spread about what happened in Dallas at that convention. They know. But they need to know those people that stood up in favor of a referendum not only exist at a convention in Dallas, but live, work, and vote in their district. The nationalist movement is going to be working hard to get every one of us a referendum legislation passed in the next session. So I would ask that you do whatever you can, whether you believe on leave or remain. I would ask that you do whatever you can to help us in that endeavor. I want to thank you for your indulgence tonight on a topic that is hopefully something that, I cannot cover Brexit, nor can I cover Texit all in one thing, but I would hope that it would encourage you to go out, do your own research, understand what that issue is, and bring those lessons home to Texas. Thank you all very much. Okay, I was told that we're doing some Q&A, probably lots of Q and lots of A, but it's however you guys want to do it. Questions, anyone? See? There's always one in every crowd. Yes, Mr. Wallace?
At the convention, for those people that didn't get to attend, it was winding down when we were talking about articles including Texas independence. The chairman of the state party was at the podium, and it looked like somebody hit him in the face with a board when we voice voted no
Right.
about discontinuing the discussion.
Well, you have to understand that the history that we have had on this issue with the state Republican Party has been one that has been dangerous. I mean, from their standpoint, I mean, they view us as, I guess you would call it radical insurgents, right? Maybe that's the term. But even when Steve Museri was the chairman of the RPT, one of the biggest challenges there was we had a rub because he and I appeared on a radio show together, both being interviewed at the same time, and he made a significant misstatement or an outright lie. I don't know which one it was, and I called him on it, and I held his feet to the fire. From that time on, he's had nothing to do with us. But the narrative that they had about this issue of Texas independence was quite simple. They said that we don't exist inside the Republican Party. That was what they were telling people. People like us do not exist inside the Republican Party. So we showed them 2009, the Research 2000 poll that showed 50% of Republicans at that time believed that Texas would be better off as an independent nation. Then the Reuters poll in 2014 that showed that 54% of Republicans believed it. And so honestly, we went to the convention and went through the petition process to essentially prove a point that there is definitely not just a small number of people inside the Republican Party or statewide, right? I think the petition actually showed that. But there is a significant percentage, and our estimation was that it was a majority of the Republican Party would vote out if it came down to it. But at the end of the day, what we showed was that there are people inside the Republican Party that believe that at a very minimum, we should have a debate and a vote on this issue. And so when you look at the reaction of the Chairman Tom Meckler on this issue, you have to understand one of two things. Either all of those things that he said about us being fringe, non-existent, whatever, either he believed all of those things to be true, or he is a liar and the most evil man since Saddam Hussein. So, although there are some mustache comparisons, I'm sure there, but that's another story. The fact of the matter is that either way it goes, it was important for us to be able to pursue this issue, to organize, to give people a voice. And as surprised as he was, I think the people that were most surprised were the people that actually stood up in favor of a vote on Texas independence, because they learned the thing that we have gone around since the inception of the Texas Nationalist Movement and tried to convince the people of Texas, and that is you are not alone. The absolute, the electricity that was in the air, people were enthusiastic about this issue. They were ready to go. And when the chairman did what he did and made the very bad call that he made, you had about 15% of the delegation that got up and walked out of the convention over that decision, because they viewed it as essentially suppressing the voice of the people of the party. So look, regardless of whether we got it on the platform, that's not the relevant thing here. The relevant thing is that we now have the momentum going into the legislative session, and we could get legislation and a vote on Texas independence out of this next session. And understand this, that nothing is going to happen between now and the early filing in November that is going to dampen the passions of the people of Texas on the issue of independence. More and more, and we saw it in light of what has transpired in Orlando and the narrative coming out of the federal government about gun confiscation and gun limitations, is we're seeing more and more of a clamor on the part of Texans to say, you know what, I get it, it took me a while, but I understand, we're going to be better off out. So, yes, sir.
Suppose you're down the road a while, you've had your referendum, people in Texas have said, we want to secede.
Right.
The Texas legislature goes along with it. Why would Massachusetts and Arkansas and those people those states let us go when we're their sugar daddy? And number two, constitutionally, where is it that you can succeed? We tried one time before, you know.
You can't. People's convention.
Well, we actually did it. We actually did it twice before, and right now we're at a 500 batting average. So, you know, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But let's get down to it. Let me take the second part of it first, which is the constitutional question. If you believe that any state leaving the Union is unconstitutional, you would have to point out where it is in the Constitution that forbids that. There are limitations placed inside the Constitution on what state governments can do, but the Constitution is absolutely silent on the issue, which means that if the Constitution is silent, then because of the 10th Amendment, it is a power that is reserved to the states. And so then you invoke Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution, which was passed after the Civil War, right? So take that off the table. Article 1, Section 2, which says all political powers inherent in the people, and the people have the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient. So we're definitely within our constitutional rights, and even if you want to take it to a modern, say, 20 to 21st century perspective on it, by virtue of the fact of the Supreme Court case of Missouri v. Holland, which happened in the early 1900s, which essentially said that treaty law is the law of the land, right? They sign on to a treaty, that treaty is enforceable even down to the state level. The fact that, strangely enough, and I can't believe I'm even going to invoke this, but the fact that the federal government signed the United Nations Treaty, and the fact that the United Nations Treaty recognizes and says that all members must abide by the right of self-determination for all peoples, means that not only would the federal government be wrong, illegal, unconstitutional, whatever you want to call it, to prevent us from having a referendum and determining how we want to govern ourselves, a Texan, if you will, but the state government, were they to stand in our way, would also be in violation of that. So there are a lot of different reasons for that. So that brings me to the first, and to be honest with you, the constitutional aspect of it is something that I guarantee will be debated ad nauseum. That I guarantee you, at some point, somewhere right now, in this wide world, someone is invoking the Supreme Court case of Texas versus White in some argument somewhere. They are probably extraordinarily thankful they are not here invoking it in front of me, but that's another story. But why would Massachusetts and those guys allow it? Well, let's get down to it. It's not theirs to allow it. If we look at Article 1,
You said peaceful.
Exactly.
So peaceful means that the Congress would have to vote on it.
No.
Congress has no say. You would have to point to some mechanism in law that would give Congress a say in the matter, and they do not. Where people point to, oftentimes, is Texas versus White. We can go down that road if you'd like. I mean, it's really kind of boring for people, but we can attack that. But I want to get back to the fundamental question. You look at Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution. Not only does it start with the words, Texas is a free and independent state, but it ends with the words that the perpetuity of the Union depends on the preservation of the right of local self-government. Okay? Article 1, Section 1 is abundantly clear, is that at the moment that the right of local self-government is impaired, then the Union is done. So I think there is very clear evidence, not just in those places. I mean, there's an overwhelming amount, but I think that's some of the kind of immediate things that we can
I
talk
understand
about.
where your argument's coming
Right.
from. What I don't understand is where you think that they're going to allow that.
It doesn't.
How do they disallow it?
Peacefully allow it.
How do they disallow it?
Well, the House.
Well, you got the
divided against
executive, you
Afghanistan.
have the
Remember that?
executive, excuse me, you have the executive branch that's not going to allow it.
So let me just throw this out here, because this strangely enough ties into the whole debate about Brexit. Those are sort of the same tactics that were used, some of the same argumentation about that. As a matter of fact, those threats are happening now. Now, they center around the economics of the situation, right? Where there will be retaliation if you go down this route. But the fact of the matter is that as Texans, we're not going to be bullied by bureaucrats. Let's get down to some statistics, okay? Essentially, what you're trying to do is say that there would potentially be some military intervention. They would declare us a state in rebellion, and they would send in the military to tamp it down. So I want to just run through the scenario for you, just so we all understand. The Texas legislature passes a piece of legislation that says the people of Texas are going to go to the polls and they're going to vote. They're going to invoke Article 1, Section 2 and Article 1, Section 1 of their Constitution and the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We're going to invoke those rights, and the people of Texas are going to go to the polls and vote on whether they want to stay as part of the American Union, right, the United States of America, or they want to reassert their status as an independent, self-governing republic. And so the people of Texas, after a healthy debate, very public debate, go to the polls and they cast their vote. And the vote is cast and it comes back in favor of exit, right? We want to go. And so we start this process from there where we go to the federal government and we say, the people have spoken, we have a mandate, this is what our people have decided, now we got to deal with some things. Like any amicable divorce, we got to deal with assets and kids and property. So we're going to have that conversation. So then the federal government says, absolutely not. I understand that millions of people in Texas went to the polls and voted for this. I understand that it was broadcast absolutely around the world, that you guys had plenty of debate on it. But what we're going to do in retaliation is we're going to call up the military and we're going to go ahead and declare your entire state in rebellion, and we're going to essentially have a military junta in Austin. Okay? That's the scenario that people lay out when they talk about this military intervention. So then you have to determine what the domino effect of that would be. And the domino effect of that would be worldwide outrage, states that are philosophically similar to us viewing that as an encroachment upon the sovereign rights of the sovereign state of Texas, an affront to the rights of the people to determine how they are governed. And then there wouldn't just be one less flag, one less star on the flag, there would be a lot of others. I would venture a guess and say that Oklahoma would probably become the largest county in Texas. Let's start with that. But at the end of the day, what you're looking at is they don't have any room to move. When half of the military already say that the people in any state have an absolute 100% right to peacefully withdraw from the Union, they're already behind the 8 ball. How are they going to determine who those people are? You know, and I shared the story the last time I was here to try to allay fears from a gentleman who, strangely enough, was sitting there across from where Keith is right now. He would not come down off of his thought or ability that we were trying to start a second civil war. But while we were on the tour last summer, I met a gentleman who was a retired officer out of the United States Army, and had a similar situation with a young man who was having wrestling with those same feelings. And essentially, this Army officer who had just retired after, I think, 22 years in the Army, he said, look, he said, I'm going to tell you, he said, these conversations have been had, and if that order ever came down from Washington, D.C. to militarily attack a state that had peacefully chosen that they wanted to go down a different road, one of two things would happen. Number one is the military would arrest the person, probably the commander-in-chief who gave the order, or number two, it would split from the enlisted all the way up to the general staff, and they wouldn't be able to deliver bottled water. So, as he said, young man, that is nothing for you to fear. We are witnessing, and I think this is why it's important, why Scotland was important to us, and why this UK vote is extremely important to us, is those things don't come up. Nobody suggested that if the UK withdrew from the EU, that NATO would come in and level London to the ground. And when the Scottish people, which strangely enough, have been in their United Kingdom for much longer than we've been in the United States, when they had their vote, when they had their referendum and their debate, not once was it ever suggested that the British military would come in and bomb Edinburgh into rubble. So, you know, either we live under a government that is more heinous than the ruler of North Korea, or we live in a modern republic. Yes, sir.
You said that if the people of Texas overwhelmingly voted to withdraw, that what would they do? They wouldn't go against the will of the people. Talk about the federal government. Well, they've proven that over and over again they'll do that. Obamacare is a prime example.
Right.
70% of the people were against Obamacare. But the heck with it, they went ahead and passed it. And I'm just being devil's advocate here. I'm not
That's
against
fine.
this whole thing. I think we'd be so much better off.
Yeah.
But
You might find it odd to understand that I actually agree with you in that regard.
what?
That we would be much better off.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I know it may be shocking. I don't know if
I just see, you know, I could see the people of Texas vote to secede.
Right.
I could even see the pressure put on the Texas legislature. I just don't see how past that point there'd be a peaceful.
They can't.
But again, well, this is again why, and look, I personally have caught a lot of flack for spending so much time and public effort on the issue of Scotland and the UK and even some of the other smaller ones. But those things, the bigger they are, the more orderly they are, right? The more public they are, only help to serve our case. Because look, the people in the rest of the states, let's be honest. If Texas voted to leave, the other people in a 100% number are not going to want to keep us, right? 100% of the people over there don't want us to stay in, right? As a matter of fact, if you'd like to take a look at my email box sometime, I can send you some emails from some people who would rather spit us out of here like bad food.
We definitely marched a different beat.
Right. So the fact of the matter, but understand, just like there is this domino effect with the UK and Brexit, this domino effect, I think, is one here. And look, what we're talking about here is, even if you're not like me, right, that you don't agree that we'd be better off, if you believe that anybody who believes that we would be better off inside the union, at the very least, you can agree that it's time that we had a very vigorous and healthy debate on what the contribution is of the federal government in our daily lives. I don't know that I don't know that we shouldn't have that conversation. I don't know that anyone with any sort of honesty can argue against that point, that we should not at least have the discussion and a serious reexamination, because I don't believe, look, when only 2% of the people, according to a survey that was held, I think, like 6 months ago, only 2% of the people believe that the federal government is fixable. 2%? It's past time to have these conversations. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to comment that if you watch social media and see what they have to say, I think our biggest problem is going to be the number of people coming from other states, because I consistently see people say, and they're serious, if Texas does that, I'm headed for Texas. I'm going to Texas. And I think we're going to have this huge influx of people from the other states. I mean, huge
I'll
influx.
give you my response, or I'll give you Kara's response, because she answers the phone. So I'm going to let you choose. Which one would you like, my response, or would you like Kara's response?
Oh, that's tough.
Carrots.
Let's do Kara's.
Yeah.
Trust me, there will be enough people moving out to go to those socialist paradises that housing and jobs will not be a problem. I actually heard her tell someone that on the phone.
I love it. That's true.
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I view this group as family, I will share something that was explained to me about a year ago. I asked a question of a Delta Force general. If Texas were to secede, where would y'all stand? He said, we'll seal the borders that quick. Nobody will get in or get out. The reason they've taken that position, their headquarters is in South Texas.
So take that, snowbirds.
But we want them to get out.
No, I'm just
If
saying.
they want to get out, we want them to go.
And nobody from the military will ever come in this state.
That's
We
what
will
they're
make
talking
sure of that.
about.
Oh, military, okay.
Yeah, there'll be nobody coming across the border
Texas.
militarily. And it doesn't take very many of those fellows to get the job done.
Give me just one second, Dave. We'll get Jeff real quick. because he's-
Hey, I just give you the opportunity to talk about, I mean, Texas solution for Texas challenges, that's great, but I think a lot of people would like to know all the positives that would be the result
Yes, that
of
is.
self-determination.
Absolutely. Look, the argument, and while, because we're talking about the Brexit idea, and really it's how it informs what we're doing here in Texas, and while that is largely a negative argument, right, there's a lot of negative argumentation, and we fall into that as well. But understand that there are a tremendous amount of positives that come from this. Look, self-government for us means that we get to implement immigration and border controls that are sensible. You know, let's be honest. If Texans were in charge of border issues and issues of immigration, would we have had what transpired in Orlando?
No.
Would it have happened?
I don't
No.
believe it would.
I don't know that any of us with any absolute certainty can say that it would not have happened, but I can guarantee you that the 80 other plots that have been, that have taken place since 9/11, that number would be significantly smaller. You know, you have to understand that illegal immigration blows a $12 billion hole in the Texas economy every single solitary year. 12 billion with a B. Now let me tell you, because I started this off talking about that I've been here 3 times. The first time that I came here to speak, that figure was at $9 billion a year. So there are some extreme positives, and I'll give you a good example, and I'll put it in the entire Brexit argument, right? One of the things that people say about Texas all the time is that there's absolutely no way that Texas could make it on its own. Now, most people say that are non-Texans, probably not anybody in this room, but strangely enough, I actually hear it. They say that we are not big enough economically, and that all of our economic prosperity flows from the mouth and the pen of the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. So they predict a financial apocalypse. Well, guess what? That's the same thing that's being used against the UK in the Brexit debate. The Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, has gotten up publicly, and one of the things that I thought was interesting that he predicted was World War III if they left, which I think that's a little excessive. But the other was the Great Brexit Global Recession. Okay, so this economic argument, but the Brexiteers, right, the pro-leave side, point to an example of a country that sits squarely in the middle of Europe that is not a member of the European Union. And that country is Switzerland. Switzerland is one of the highest exporting countries out of Europe. They are arguably the richest and most prosperous country. And I'll have to tell you that I had a speaking engagement in Houston several weeks back. And an investment banker looked at me and said, you know, when people realize that Texas leaving the Union will make us rich like Switzerland or Monaco, they'll knock the doors down at the polling place to vote out. Okay, that's what happens. What happens when you eliminate 175,000 pages of excessive regulation? What happens? What happens to your economy when you eliminate the overregulation? And what is interesting about it, to put it in a historical context, and I would just suggest, if you guys want a quick primer on it, go watch Brexit the movie. It's on YouTube. But one of the things is that what spurred on the German miracle post-World War II was the guy that they put in charge of their financial recovery, and the first thing that he did was he repealed virtually all economic regulations that were written under the Third Reich. And the German miracle happened. And in contrast, what happened with the UK was they kept their wartime economy with centralized planning and control and rationing and regulation. Everything that you could imagine from a business standpoint had some regulation about it and had some bureaucrat to oversee it. And that's why they, by 1973, were called the sick man of Europe. Their economy was in a shambles. So rather than go down that path that gave Germany its prosperity. The EU has adopted the Washington, D.C. mindset, that if it sits still long enough, it must have a regulation written to control how long it sits there and when it must move. Okay, David, sorry.
I was gonna say that staying in the Union in its original form as it written, as the founders had written it, is a great, wonderful thing. But
Right.
the problem is, like I said, we all have noticed and we see people that are paying attention, is they're not abiding by that contract any longer.
Exactly.
Therefore, being that, you have to do something.
Well, and I think this gets down to sort of the relationship of Texas and the rest of the states, you know, and that's why you'll hear me a lot of times couch it that way. You know, obviously, this is the political class against, that thinks they know what's best for all of us versus the ordinary people who we absolutely know we know what's the best. It's the bureaucracy versus the freedom lovers, and some want to couch it as the United States against Texas. I mean, I've been called un-American so many times. People probably think I have an ISIS flag flying outside of my house. But the fact of the matter is there's nothing about America that I don't like. It's the Union, this political and economic behemoth and monstrosity that has become the problem. And what you said is essentially one of the arguments that's being made in Europe right now, which is, look, let's leave. Right? Let's abandon this idea of a totally integrated political and economic union, and then let's work together, let's cooperate together, let's be friends on our terms. Let's not be tied and bound to something that is going to end in disaster for all of us, but as Britons, let us negotiate how we interact with one another. And I think that's the same thing that we've got to talk about here. You know, this fear-mongering that happens, I've seen it so many times before. This fear-mongering here. Well, what are you going to do when they embargo you? They're not going to embargo us. They want to trade with us. Why? Because we make stuff. They want stuff. We will sell them stuff, and they will gladly pay for it. Right? We trade. We can trade with 200 other countries around the world, and we can do it on our terms. Right? Instead of these horrible free trade agreements that get shoved down our throat from bureaucrats and multinational corporations that only serve to feed the bureaucracy and stifle innovation and growth here. Texas gets it right on economics 100% of the time.
What's his name, the Mavericks?
Mark Cuban.
Mark Cuban. Other day, he was on Fox spewing the garbage of, it's a privilege to pay the taxes to support the system that we have in the United States, and I about lost it.
Well, you know, that's why guys like Mark Cuban will probably never support what we do, because our supporters come from all walks of life, right? And the people that are the most enthusiastic about Texas independence are the ones they're able to get by, but they're not able to get ahead because of what this system has done to them. And we have the power in our hands to change that. What we need is we need a debate and we need a vote on Texas independence. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't we have to have our own monetary system?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that.
National debt?
I was about to.
Okay, so, okay, Social Security first. Federal benefits payments that are owed and due to individuals are still contractually obligated by the federal government, but again, they can repeal those at any time by law. But even the Social Security Administration itself says that you can live outside the United States and collect Social Security benefit payments. The benefit payments from the federal government amount to a total of about $74 billion a year. So even if the federal government abrogated their responsibility and said, hey, we're going to throw you out on the street, we don't care if you starve to death or not, the people of Texas, as it stands right now, could absolutely pick up that slack and take care of that burden. And look, they've broken promises before, right? I had a gentleman tell me one time, if you ever believe that the federal government upholds promises, talk to an Indian, right? So we know they break promises. And look, whether we're in or out of the union, be prepared. They're getting ready to break the promise that they have made on the issues of Social Security and those and veterans benefits. I mean, we could get into that, but we actually have a document on our website where we did a study called Can Texas Make It, where we break down all of those figures and the issue of Social Security is in there. Okay, your question was national debt, I got an answer to that question, strangely enough, after 20 years, I've never heard an answer. All the answers I gave were okay. This guy just slam dunked me on the court. Here's his thing, and I think it should probably be our attitude toward a lot of things. We will absolutely pay our share of the national debt. While we were part of the union, it was accumulated and we will pay it. Now, how that's calculated, that's a different story. However, our caveat is we will pay it at the same rate that they repay their portions of the national debt. Look, that guy blew me out of the box. I love it. And your other question
Monetary
was
system.
national debt, and there was one other.
Currency.
Currency. Okay, so currency is an issue. One of the things that you have to contend with is that we do not have to immediately come up with our own currency. That's not necessary. You can adopt a currency from another country. Other countries do it all the time with the US dollar. Some countries that are not inside the Eurozone actually have the euro as an official currency. However, this is what I will tell you, is that as an organization, it's one of the areas that we have made the most significant progress toward independence. Back in 2010, we saw legislation that would essentially establish a gold depository in Texas. From that time, we championed that legislation. We blew up the switchboards at the legislature every session. And finally, State Rep Giovanni Capriglione, he championed that thing, he got it passed. Now, what's interesting about it is the headline that everybody said is Texas gets its own Fort Knox, right? They're repatriating Texas gold. You'll be able to have a depository. But what most people missed in that legislation was that it specifically sets up a system of exchange denominated in the precious metals inside that depository. So much like Texas has a proto-military through the Texas Military Department and the Texas Military Forces, Texas has the makings of its own currency. It's just a little bit longer, and we'll be there. But it won't take long to get that done at all. Yes, sir.
So what, if we do become independent, what is the procedure for forming government? You know, let's say we'll have a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution, and another thing is, for instance, Vermont's the other state that is seeking the independence.
Right.
And they're much smaller, though I would say they're more centralized. But would you envision Texas as a state becoming a federal state and, you know, delegating a lot of the powers local? Of course, obviously education and, you know, healthcare probably and some of the other powers would be more local. But would it be more of a federal system where Texas would be divided into different administrative districts, and where in Austin or wherever the capital would be at, having all the control, be more towards the people and voting control?
Okay, so let me take. Okay, let me take them in order. The first question, because I got sort of sidetracked from my first question, dealt with.
Well, I mean, first
The Constitutional Convention. Okay, something to bear in mind is that whatever is law now continues to be law until it's no longer law. Okay, so what that essentially means is that the day after the independence vote, nothing changes, right? Trash is going to still get picked up. If you call 911, they'll show up 5 minutes after you shoot the intruder. Things like that will be done, right? So that's the thing, and whatever's in effect is still law. So what that means is, how do we then handle the transition from a state government over to a national government? That can happen in one of two ways. Number one is either a full-blown constitutional convention, which if anyone went to the Republican State Convention, you can understand why that might be a little problematic. But the other is similar to what happened in the 1960s when they passed what's called the Deadwood Amendment, where rather than doing a full-blown constitutional rewrite, they were trying to go through and clear out redundant language or outdated language, and there are things that deal with Spanish land grants and a lot of different things like that. They actually got all of those changes and compiled them into one constitutional amendment, repealing specific provisions in mass, and then the people went and voted on it. So that is, from the standpoint of where I'm at now, what I would advocate the changes be, which would be to institute constitutionally the functions that are missing from the state of Texas to being a full-blown self-governing independent republic, and then putting those questions to the voters. To your second question, Vermont is something that is, strangely enough, near and dear to my heart. Are you familiar with Dr. Thomas Naylor?
I've read a little bit about it, but I'm not familiar.
Dr. Naylor and I were very close friends until he passed a few years ago. I would consider Dr. Naylor probably one of my mentors. He wrote a phenomenal book on the Second Vermont Republic called, strangely enough, Secession. And people always thought it was odd that a professor emeritus of economics from Duke University would be leading the charge for the Green Mountain State to exit the Union. But what is interesting about it is they are definitely more centralized. He and I have had this conversation, strangely enough, before about the similarities and the differences here. Texas, throughout its history, has never been a federated state, which is, I think, is kind of odd that we have sort of a bicameral legislature. We've never been a federal state. Right now, these administrative districts that you're talking about, counties are actually by law considered to be administrative subdivisions of the state. So, we're sort of there, but Texas has never been. We've been what is essentially a unitary nation state. So, yes, sir.
What would happen, we got federal penitentiaries in the state of Texas, what would happen to those in the state and the people that work in them?
Well, if I don't get what I want, I will probably be in one. I'm sure that I've violated some law here tonight. But what will happen to them? It's the same thing. We actually talked about this before we started about the military bases. Some of those are owned, some of them are leased facilities. But the fact of the matter is that's all part of the children, property, and assets discussion that transpires. But you see, there is this sort of underlying thought that people have sometimes that the Texas leaving the Union has got to end in some sort of negative way, right? There are amicable divorces. I mean, it does happen. And we, strangely enough, we saw it with the dissolution of all things of the Soviet Union, where they had vigorous negotiations over the division of the Black Sea Fleet, right? The naval fleet that is on the Black Sea. So you see these things happen all the time. There can be. And at the end of the day, what's going to drive these things, particularly with things like federal prisons and the military, is just because we are no longer in economic or political union does not mean that our common interests evaporate. Our security concerns, probably their security concerns. Their national defense concerns, still our national defense concerns. Their ability to imprison, hardcore criminals, maybe we'll operate them on a contract basis to them. I mean, those are things that can be discussed and that there are solutions out there for, and they're easily attainable. And honestly, those are the most probable outcomes.
I've got a friend of mine, her husband works at a federal penitentiary, and that's one of her things about Texas not seceding is her husband would be probably messed over because he's a federal employee.
Well, where else are we going to jail failed federal bureaucrats?
Shoot,
I mean, if you're listening at home, that is a joke. Not really. Anyway, does anybody have any more questions?
Did
Because
Marilyn,
I
do you
am
have a
out of
question?
coffee.
Yeah, how do you spell Brexit?
B-R-E-X-I-T. B-R-E-X-I-T. Brexit. You'll see it. Brexit, Frexit, Grexit. I don't know what they're going to do with Portugal.
This the same thing you're talking about, the BRICS that they're talking about?
No, BRICS, that's a different thing. BRICS is a whole other discussion.
LaRouche, the LaRouche guy?
Yeah, well, no, that's a different topic that I'm not in.
Yeah.
But this idea of Brexit, understand if you look it up, if you do any searches for it, what you're going to find is a mountain of information. Most people, the Scottish referendum snuck up on them. They're like, what do you mean Scotland's voting next week to leave? It's like, well, wait a minute. They've had a formal 2-year debate and about 800 years worth of work to get there. This idea of Brexit has been taking place since 1973, and I'm glad to see, and I've got friends over there in the UK Independence Party. Every day, I'm just overjoyed that they're getting this opportunity, and I look forward to the day when we get ours. So I want to thank you guys so much. I appreciate you attending. I want to turn it back over to you.
Thanks for coming. That's it. Appreciate you coming, Daniel.
Jeff,
Can't follow that.
That is the worst conclusion ever.